Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome back to Fish University. If you've been following the podcast, you know that my day job is to serve as Mississippi's Fisheries Extension Specialist. Although my title says the word fish, I spend about half of my time fielding questions on aquatic plants. In fact, my most common question that I receive is, what weed is this and how do I kill it? But aquatic plants are only weeds when they interfere with how we interact with water. Aquatic plants and algae are critical components of the aquatic ecosystem. With this in mind, I selected today's guest because he's an expert on aquatic plants and their control, and is the perfect person to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of water weeds. Dr. Gray Turnage is an assistant extension and research professor with the Geosystems Research Institute and is a leader in herbicide testing and plant treatment, among other things. Gray, how's it going today?
That's good, Wes. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about maybe your background, where you come from, and how you got into working with aquatic plants?
Yeah, so I'm actually a native of Mississippi. I grew up on our Gulf Coast in Biloxi. Through a long, circuitous college process, I ended up at Mississippi State. I got all three of my degrees here. I started my current position in the Geosystems Research Institute under Dr. John Madsen when he was here. I was his research associate. He moved on to another job in 2014, and I took over our aquatic plant research program at Mississippi State and have been doing that ever since. It's a very fun and rewarding career. It's taken me to places in the world that I never thought I would have gone.
Yeah, and I know you do a lot of the testing of new herbicides when they come out, their efficacy. But I think I'll start this program off with a story about some of the more recent on-the-ground work you've done, because I saw you give a presentation a year or two ago about a Giant Salvinia infestation down in Ross Barnett Reservoir, and most of the photos had the flamethrower, or you're using the flamethrower to control. We're not going to talk about flamethrowers today, but that was a cool story. Tell us a little bit about that situation, because wasn't that the first time that Giant Salvinia has ever been eradicated from a larger system?
It was not the first time that it had been eradicated from a larger system, but you can count on one hand the number of times it's been eradicated from a larger system. So that was one of the few success stories we have against that aquatic weed.
Yeah, and it's a particularly nasty weed. So tell us about that situation, what happened in Ross Barnett, and a little bit about it.
So we're not exactly sure how the plant got into the Ross Barnett, but it was at least the second or third invasion that we'd found. The first two were small. We were able to get them out as individual plants when they were found near a boat ramp. But this was definitely the largest of the three invasions. It was found in a backwater area on Pelahatchie Bay. By the time it was detected, it had spread to cover 6 or 7 acres, I believe, across a 40-acre area. And that particular plant can reproduce and spread very rapidly. And on a hot summer day, conditions are perfect. It can double its biomass in 2 or 3 days. So it spreads very, very quickly. It's a floating plant, so it's not restricted to the edges of a water body like rooted plants are. So it can form a mat across the surface of a water body. If you see some of the reservoirs in Texas and Louisiana that have that plant, they're slam full, side to side, end to end, and it forms a floating mat about 1 meter thick in the worst cases. So you can't get a boat through it, you can't fish in it, you can't swim in it, and even the wildlife can't use that water underneath. The floating mat blocks sunlight from reaching algae and submerged plants in the water column that are primary producers of the dissolved oxygen that our fish need. And without those producing dissolved oxygen, the fish can't use the water either. So they move to other sites. Anything that feeds on fish or those plants is also going to move out of that area because the resource they need isn't there. So that plant in particular inhibits water use by humans and wildlife. So it's a pretty nasty player. As far as the infestation on the Ross Barnett, I actually didn't get to use the flamethrower, but I was there when it was used. It was pretty impressive. We had to stress that plant multiple ways. That's a form of management called integrated pest management, where you use multiple control techniques to compound stress on a species so that it can't survive. In that particular instance, we used drawdown, which is pulling the water out of the site so that we stranded the Salvinia on dry ground. However, there was still enough moisture in the soil that the plant was able to persist. So we used herbicides to also stress the plant, but because the plant forms those mats and grows so rapidly, it was still able to persist and outgrow some of the herbicide treatments. It was able to hide up under other plants, and that made it hard to find in some cases. So we used more herbicide to get those plants out of the way. And then we had to go in with chainsaws to cut the dead overlying plants out of the way so we could get to the Salvinia. We had to burn some of that area with the flamethrower in order to be able to find all of the Salvinia. And then we had to use more herbicide. In addition to that, we had to use floating booms to keep the plant from moving off-site before we dropped the water level. And the biggest thing was we needed the public to stay out of the way and out of that area so that they weren't going to be moving the plant further. If that had happened, all of our efforts to control it would have been for nothing, and the plant probably would have still been in the reservoir today. None of us enjoyed closing Pelahatchie Bay to the public, but it was necessary in order to get that plant under control. We did get a little pushback for that. People weren't aware of just how aggressive the growth of this plant is. But if you look at the reservoirs in our neighboring states that have been infested, and then even some of the smaller lakes in our own state that have been infested, it doesn't take this plant long to completely cover the water. And once it's in there in large quantities, it's there to stay. So we really appreciated all the support we got from Pearl River Valley group that is responsible for managing the reservoir. They really came alongside of us and gave us everything we needed to get that plant out. We being the Salvinia task force that was put together, and that we appreciated the public support in letting us do what we needed to protect that water resource.
I've seen Salvinia, I don't know if it's giant or common, out on the waterway, but it doesn't seem like that's been a real problem or a real concern of people. Is there a different reason why the occurrence of Salvinia is not a real big problem? Is it because it's common Salvinia, or is it?
Well, there's both on the waterway. There's common and giants. Giant showed up on Lakes Columbus and Aberdeen around 2018, I think. Common Salvinia had been in the waterway for a long time. Up here, we're just about on the northern edge of where Salvinia can overwinter. I mean, it will still overwinter fine here. It just won't grow as rapidly as it does the further south you get. And still a somewhat new invader to that system, so it hasn't really built up its numbers. And they've been actively looking for it and managing it. The Corps of Engineers manages the waterway. They have a team of wildlife biologists that part of their job is to manage those plants and keep them from establishing a foothold. And they're doing a good job of keeping Salvinia suppressed in that system. It's probably there to stay, but due to the location geographically, the management that's going on, and it's a different system, it's a flowing system, even though it's not a lot of flow in that system, Salvinia just hasn't taken off in the numbers that it has down south.
Now, of course, Salvinia, both giant and common, they're not native to this area. They're extremely invasive when they get into a system, but we have a lot of native plants as well. And one of the things that I think that I've always tried to stress to people is that all plants aren't inherently bad. In fact, they're a very important part of the aquatic ecosystem. You mentioned that the Salvinia shades out the water. Well, it's shading out the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton is the base of the food chain. And so in a farm pond, which I know a lot of my listeners are farm pond owners, your pond water turns green. That green is the primary production of the system that's being eaten by zooplankton, which is being eaten by insects and small fish and eventually big fish. That's the base of your food chain. That is your food plot for your deer, basically. That's where the food comes from that grows the things you care about. But even other species of plants, they provide a lot of services to a system. Things like pondweeds, potamogetons, or buttonbush along the edges. That's habitat for fish. It's habitat for birds. It's food for fish and birds, waterfowl. Plants are a very important part of the ecosystem, and A lot of times I feel like our resources for plant management are written in a way that's, if you see plants in your pond, kill them. I think that we've been trying to get away from that. So let's talk a little bit about what plants need to grow, how they become successful, and why they sometimes become a problem.
Yeah. So that just like land plants, they need light, they need water, they need nutrients. But in the case of aquatic plants, they just need a lot more water. They've adapted to survive in that aquatic environment. And a lot of times when I give presentations to stakeholder groups about the control of invasive plants, one of the first slides I have is exactly what you're talking about, that not all plants are bad. We do need some for a healthy ecosystem. It's when they grow to nuisance levels that something needs to be done. But there are a lot of benefits to having a diverse plant community in a pond at the appropriate levels. They stabilize shoreline sediments, which will reduce erosion into your pond and thereby reduce sedimentation. They can also keep some of those suspended sediments anchored to the bottom so it clears your water up. And they provide habitat for young of the year fish, for insects, for all of those organisms that are at the lower stages of the food web. And they also pump that dissolved oxygen that we need into the water column along with your phytoplankton that gives the fish and all those aquatic insects and mollusks and all that, gives them all the resources they need to survive in that system as well. Typically, when I talk about aquatic plant management, one of the first things, like you said, is not all plants are bad. And that's why it's very important that we get a good ID on the front end of the problem species so that we can understand, is it a plant we want to manage? If it is, then we move forward developing a management plan or technique. If it's not, then we take a step back and reassess the situation.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why plants, a lot of the reasons why plants can become problematic too is, as you said, it interferes with human use. So it's a nuisance to humans. It can be a nuisance to biological systems too, like the case of the Salvinia getting, 3 or 4 feet thick. But, if the plants are in a place that's you want to swim at, your beach area, you can clean those plants up. Certainly plants that block boating access, water intakes are problematic. But the plants themselves, they're part of the ecosystem. They provide habitat. Fish use them. Animals eat from them. Fish spawn on them. So, the plants are they're an important part of the ecosystem. Now, in the South, when you get down into southern ponds, aquatic plants can be problematic because you rely on largemouth bass to control prey populations and prey populations to feed largemouth bass. And when you have structure that enables prey to hide from bass, having that excessive structure kind of throws the community balance out of whack because the bass can't get to the prey and the prey can hide effectively from the bass. So the prey don't grow, the bass don't grow. But as you move further north, it's actually been found that you need more and more plant coverage because bass reproduce less. And when you don't have a lot of plant cover, bass tend to be eliminated from ponds. My job here in Mississippi is usually telling people, well, keep plants down to a minimum, 10% coverage or 15% coverage. If you move up north, say to Minnesota, usually they're recommended 30 and 40% coverage of aquatic plants for fish balance, fish population balance. So, plants certainly are very important. We mentioned that they become a weed when they simply interfere with your use. Let's move into when you have a problem. So let's say we have an aquatic plant issue. What are the steps that we need to take to control the plant? So what's the very first thing that someone should do?
Well, the first thing is to get a good plant ID so we know exactly which species we're dealing with. All of the following management steps are going to come from that ID. If we get the ID wrong, in the case of herbicides, you may end up selecting an herbicide that has no activity on that plant. So you've wasted time, you've wasted money. If you misidentify a plant as a native species and decide to do nothing and it ends up being an invasive species, it may rapidly cover your water body to the point where it's too late to do anything, and your management may become much more expensive on the back end. So the first step is always get a good plant ID and know exactly which species you're dealing with, and then start to formulate a management plan. And at that point, one of the first things to do is identify the goals for your water body. and the uses of that water. Is this an irrigation pond? Is it for watering livestock? Is it for just having a pond for the grandkids to fish in? Is it going to be a trophy bass pond? The end use is going to heavily dictate the management steps that you take to get that plant out of there. That's also the time to assess the budget that you have to work with. After you've formulated a budget and the end uses of your water body, then you can start identifying specific management techniques. And not all of them are herbicide based. It could be as simple as a partial drawdown to expose that sediment where that plant problem is to freezing temperatures in the wintertime or extreme heat in the summertime. That may be enough to control that plant. And then you can flood it back up. In some cases, it may be herbicide. In some cases, it may be, like with Salvinia, it may be herbicide and drawdown and cutting. It may be a lot of steps in there. But you identify management techniques and alternative techniques. In some cases, particularly with herbicide, we have documented herbicide resistance occurring in plant populations. If you use an herbicide that the scientific literature says should work, and it doesn't, you may have an herbicide-resistant population. And in that case, you have to have a fallback method of control. So it's important to not just identify your primary control technique, but also identify alternatives in case you have to switch gears as you move forward. And then the last thing, which is so overlooked, is that you need to monitor. And the monitoring needs to start before you do management. You need to know the baseline problem, the severity of it, and then you need to monitor after management so that you can actually take note of whether or not your management is working and holding. A lot of times people, in particular in the case of herbicide, they'll put the herbicide on the plant will die, and they walk away. And they may look at it again in 2 months. Okay, the plant's still not there, so my management worked. And then they come back in a year, and the plant problem is right back. And a lot of that could be avoided if they were out there every month or two after management, periodically looking at that water body to make sure that the strategy is still working and giving them the results they want.
So regarding herbicide selection, there's several different kinds of herbicides. But really, we usually classify them into how they work. So we have contact herbicides, which kill anything that they're sprayed on, and we have systemic herbicides, which are transported throughout the plant. But we also have, adjuvants that we add to the herbicides. Let's talk a little bit about how to select herbicide types and the special additives that we put with them to help them work more effectively.
Yeah, so for general aquatic use in the U.S., we have 15 registered herbicides versus hundreds that we can use in the terrestrial systems in the U.S. The reason we only have 15 is that these herbicides have to undergo a lot more testing, and provide the companies that manufacture them have to make that data available to the U.S. EPA. And then the EPA has the final say on whether or not that herbicide is legal for use in aquatics. They'll issue what they call a Section 3 label for general aquatic use. We also have 2 other chemicals that we use for control of plants, but they don't work the same way herbicides do. One is a dye, like a food grade dye that you put in the water. It doesn't actually enter the plants. It just reflects sunlight. Plants can't get the sunlight they need. They die from starvation, essentially. Another is a peroxide-based chemical that we use mostly for algae control. And it works by oxidizing cells. You can think of that as it's basically giving a bad chemical burn to the outside of the cells, and then they fall apart and die. It's not particularly active on plants. It doesn't enter plants and work the same way as our 15 other herbicides do. So while it is a chemical used in aquatics, it's not used the same way, and it doesn't act on the plants and algae the same way as other herbicides do. Now, those 15 herbicides, as you mentioned, we have contacts and we have systemics. Like you said, the contacts, they kill the tissue they touch, but they don't move through the plant to the root system, or vice versa. If they're in the water, they don't go through the roots up to the leaves of the plant. Our systemic herbicides do. They get on the foliage and they'll move all the way through the plant, and they'll usually kill the whole individual. Within those categories of contact and systemic, you have multiple modes of action. And the modes of action are basically how the herbicide works in the plant. So a great example is diquat. It's a contact herbicide. It moves into the cells of the plant, just a few cells deep on the leaf, and it disrupts the photosynthetic process so that the plant can't survive. You switch over to another herbicide like 2,4-D, which is a systemic. It doesn't disrupt photosynthesis. It mimics a plant hormone called auxin that's responsible for plant growth. Natural auxin produced in the plants allow the plants to upregulate and downregulate growth as they move through different life stages. Synthetic auxins move into the plant and they bind in the place of natural auxin, and the plants can't downregulate their growth, and they just continue to grow until they die. They grow themselves to death. So those modes of action, those aren't the only ones, but those are just an example of how the herbicides we do have they work on the plants differently. Herbicide selection becomes critical because not all species are sensitive to all the herbicides we have. The auxinic herbicides in particular, especially in a terrestrial setting, are almost exclusively used on monocot plants. You have monocots and dicots as a general distinction among plant types. Think of dicots as broadleaf plants and monocots as a lot like your grasses and sedges. The auxinic herbicides don't work as well on the grasses and sedges as they do the broadleaves in general. That's not a hard rule, but it's a general rule of thumb. So in the case of a monocot plant, if it gets into your pond, you may not want to think about using an auxinic herbicide. You may want to use a different one that has a different mode of action, that has sensitivity on that plant. So herbicide selection is critical because you want to make sure the one you select, the one you spend money on, is actually going to work on the species. Now, regarding adjuvants, you can only use in aquatics non-ionic surfactants. A surfactant, it's a class of adjuvant. Within the adjuvant world, you have surfactants, you have spreaders, stickers, sinkers. All of them make that herbicide droplet do different things that help increase the chances of it getting into a plant. Surfactants in particular make the droplet, instead of being round, they make it more of a pancake shape, which increases the contact with the leaf surface between that droplet and the leaf surface, and it increases the amount of surface area that can take up herbicide on the plant. In aquatics, we only use non-ionic surfactants and crop oil concentrates or methylated seed oils. The reason we do that is because other surfactants can be harmful to fish and aquatic organisms. They burn the gills up on the fish, and the fish can't breathe right. So these surfactants are almost as critical as the herbicide you select because you don't want to have off-target damage on other organisms in your water body. A great example of an ionic surfactant is dish soap. Growing up, I remember folks would add a little dish soap to their herbicide solution because it is a good surfactant in a terrestrial setting, but it's also not labeled for that, so it's illegal to do that. And in an aquatic setting, it can harm your fish and your aquatic organisms. Only use surfactants that are labeled for aquatic use, and only use herbicides that are labeled for aquatic use. And that is another key issue with herbicide technology, is that people will assume that a jug of glyphosate for terrestrial use can be used in an aquatic setting, and that's not the case. Sometimes companies will add surfactants to a terrestrial labeled herbicide jug that is geared towards use in that setting, but that surfactant may not be appropriate for the aquatic setting. So only use herbicides that actually have aquatic use label language on that label. And the label is the law. It's the federal law and the state law. So you have to use herbicides in accordance with that label, or you could get yourself in some trouble, or you could cause damage to your aquatic resource that is going to further compound your management issues.
Yeah, a good example of that, I'm sure most people are familiar with the brand name Roundup. Roundup is a glyphosate used in terrestrial settings, but Roundup has surfactants in it that can harm fish, and it's illegal to use it in water. Roundup does make an aquatic version with a different surfactant, but it's very important you don't switch between the two. If you may have Roundup in the shelf for your garden, that's not appropriate to take that down to your pond and spray it in your pond, because it's not the chemical. The herbicide's fine. It's the surfactants and the additives that are in there that can harm your fish. Yeah, as you said, the label is the law. You're not only risking your fish, you're risking a violation of the law. So make sure whatever you use, whether it's the surfactant or the herbicide, if it doesn't say aquatic approved or it doesn't have aquatic instructions on the label, it's probably not okay to use it in the water. Sometimes there are several herbicides that will work with a particular plant species, right? The other thing to think about is your budget. Some of these herbicides, you mentioned 2,4-D, that's pretty cheap. Or maybe we're talking about fluoridone, that's pretty expensive. And when I say pretty expensive, we're talking pushing $2,000 a gallon. Obviously, you don't just want to go out and randomly select an herbicide because, one, it may not work, and two, it may not be the cheapest option. You need to talk to an expert like Gray, like your local extension office, and find out what the best and most affordable option is, because you don't want to throw money in your pond. You want to do something the most economically efficient way possible and effectively.
And another thing to keep in mind with herbicide use is that it's not always appropriate to treat the entire pond at one time. You need to buy enough herbicide to use on the entire pond, but as your plants die after that treatment, the microbes that break them down use the dissolved oxygen in the water as a fuel source. And if you kill all of the vegetation at one time, you're risking a DO depletion, the dissolved oxygen depletion, that can cause a fish kill. Typically, if you have a whole pond infestation, you treat it in stages so that you're only dropping the dissolved oxygen in one section of the pond, but leaving a refuge or a nursery for the fish to retreat to that has plenty of oxygen. That's another thing that gets overlooked a lot with herbicide use, and that can cause a fish kill if it's done wrong. So not only is selecting the herbicide critical, but using it appropriately can be just as important.
We usually recommend either treat 1/3 to 1/4 of the pond at a time, with, depending on the herbicide, a week to 2 weeks between applications, for that very reason, so that as that plant material dies, it decomposes. Once it decomposes, it uses up oxygen. You don't want to do that to your whole pond at once. Now, if you've just got a small ring of primrose around the edges that sticks out 5 feet and your pond is 4 acres, you probably could treat the whole pond. That's probably less than 1/4 of your pond that's affected. But if you're dealing with weeds like southern Naiad that's spread throughout the lake, probably better off treating in small batches. And if you have the capacity to aerate while you do it, that's an extra security blanket, I guess, if you have that capacity. So once you selected the best herbicide, you're going to need to figure out the appropriate rate to treat at, in which case you're going to need to do some calculations, right? So you're either going to need to know the area of the coverage that you have, or you're going to need to know the pond volume, depending on the treatment method. Let's talk about that a little bit and how folks can make calculations on their ponds.
Yeah, so if it's an emergent plant, which is a plant that's rooted in the lake bed but has foliage sticking up out of the water into the atmosphere, you're going to need to know the surface area or the surface acres that need to be treated. That can be calculated multiple ways. One is just good old-fashioned, get a tape measure out, estimate the shape, and then use your high school math functions to calculate the area of that infestation. Another way that I use a lot is just using freely available software that can calculate area for you. Google Earth Pro is a good example. They have a polygon tool in there. You can draw an outline around your area of interest, and it will calculate the area in there for you. For submerged plants, you also need to know the volume of the water. Because a lot of times you're not applying herbicide to the surface, you're injecting it in the water, and you have to hit a critical concentration that will give you plant kill. And the best way to estimate volume of a pond is just get out there in a boat with a sounding rod or a depth finder, take the depth across the pond at multiple points. 15 or 20 points or so is good for anything under about 10 acres. And it's important that people record depth all over the pond. I usually set up a grid of points and move across the pond systematically, taking those depths. A lot of times when I get a call that I've got a weed in the water, how do I kill it? And we get down through the process of setting up a management plan. It comes time to calculate the amount of herbicide we need. I ask the landowner or the stakeholder, what's your average depth in the pond? 9 times out of 10, well, it's 10 or 11 feet over at the levee. That's not average depth. That's maximum depth. We need average depth. And so recording those depth measurements all over the pond and then taking the average of those, that gives you average depth. And then you need the surface area of the pond. Again, you can hike around it with a tape measure and do some complex functions, or you can find some software that will help you do that. But once you have the surface area and the average depth, you multiply those together and you get the volume of your pond, typically in acre feet. We measure our area in acres and we measure our depth in feet. So you end up with a unit that is acre feet. That is the amount of volume, 1 acre in size, that's 1 foot deep. The reason we want acre feet is that most of your herbicide recommendations are written for acre feet unit, because we're typically treating larger volumes and you need a unit of that size to make those calculations make sense. So once you have your volume of water for submerged plants or your surface area for emergent plants, Then you can look at the herbicide label on the jug that you've selected, or you can look at the label on the herbicide you've selected. And there's usually a table on there somewhere that tells you how many gallons of herbicide or how many ounces you need per acre foot of water to reach a target concentration. And that's a pretty simple calculation there. How many acre feet do I have? How many ounces or gallons do I need per acre foot? And then you can do the math from there and calculate how much herbicide you'll need to treat your infestation.
A couple of important points on calculating the volume of the pond is one is if you're using a depth finder, make sure your depth finder is calibrated to the surface of the water. I know a lot of folks that they install a depth finder on their trolling motor or on their transom, and the transducer is a foot or maybe two under the water, and they don't calibrate it. You're underestimating depth by 2 feet. In a 5-acre pond, you're going to underestimate volume by about 10 acre feet if you're using a depth finder. The other thing is you may know the volume of your pond. When you built it, you may have had it well mapped out. But 2 things are going on that can change that. One is that pond is sedimenting in through time. So an older pond or pond that's 5 or 6 years old is not going to be as deep as it was when it was built. And the second thing is the water level may not be at full pool when you need to treat. So take all of those things into consideration when you're estimating these volumes or these surface areas, that things may not be the way they were when you designed the pond because of changes in water level. Mississippi's in a big drought right now. No pond is at full pool right now. The other thing, and this is just going back to herbicide selection, one of the biggest pet peeves I have is where people get their recommendations. I get a lot of folks who get recommendations from places that are not only wrong, they're illegal. So be careful where you get your recommendations from. Get it from a reliable source like your extension service or your state fisheries management agency, your NRCS office, somebody who's legally liable to give you the right recommendation. But I had a very high level person within a state agency once tell me, I know it's illegal, but I put this in my pond. So don't do that. You're breaking the law and it may not be safe for your fish. So get your recommendations from a very reliable source. Now you've identified the plant. You've selected the herbicide and your adjuvants. You've made the calculations for how much you need. You've purchased the herbicides and the surfactant. And now it's time to treat. So let's talk about some of the best management practices to treating aquatic vegetation with herbicides and some of the ways to go about doing it.
So one of the first things is make sure you have the appropriate PPE, that stands for personal protective equipment. That will be listed on your herbicide jug. You definitely want to make sure that you're wearing a long sleeve shirt if the PPE requirement on the jug has that, gloves if it requires that, a mask or respirator if it requires that. So make sure you read that and you know exactly what PPE you need, and have that on site. That's step number one. Number two is take the time to go back over everything. Make sure you're not missing any steps. You haven't forgotten something, especially something critical. And then you're ready to start mixing your herbicide. Once you've got it mixed, depending on the plant species, it may be a foliar spray, which is just like you would do in a terrestrial setting. Put it in an ATV sprayer or a tractor sprayer or a pump up sprayer and, navigate through the infestation, spraying the foliage. If it's going to be a submersed injection for submersed plants, the setup is going to be a little bit different. You're going to use a drop hose, which instead of having an herbicide nozzle that you spray with, you're going to have a hose hanging in the water that herbicide solution will flow through from your sprayer into the water column, and you'll go back and forth in a boat, or if it's close to the shoreline, you can probably go through it with a kayak or something like that. But typically we use a John boat with a trolling motor for farm ponds. You just navigate across the surface of the water, injecting that herbicide in there, or not always the surface of the water, the surface of the infestation, because you're not always treating the whole pond. But that's your typical setup for a submersed injection, is a sprayer with a drop hose that gets the herbicide down to where the plants are. That brings back the earlier point I made about knowing your water body, doing your monitoring. A lot of times in our summer months, when we start to think about treating ponds, some of them have already stratified and you have a thermocline. If anybody's jumped in a pond on a hot summer day, about 3 feet down, you pass through a layer of water and it gets real cold. The upper layer is warm. You want to make sure that your drop hoses are in the correct layers of water where your plants are, because the herbicide applied to one layer of water, warm water versus cold water, it won't always move through the water column to that cold layer or upwards to that hot layer. It'll stay in the layer that it's been applied to because of different densities of water, things like that. So if you have a plant growing from the pond bottom through cold water into the warmer upper water, but you only apply your herbicide in that layer of warm water, you'll go back a few weeks later and it'll look like you mowed your plants off right at that thermocline. The herbicide won't get down to the bottom of the plant. So you want to make sure you have a drop hose or multiple drop hoses applying your herbicide in the correct layer of water where the plants are to increase your chances of getting the level of control you want or you need.
Is that true just for the contact herbicides, or is that true for systemic herbicides as well?
Mostly for the contact herbicides, but we do see similar phenomenon with some of our systemics, not all, but some of them. They won't move through the layers of water, but the systemics can translocate down through the plants into that lower level of water. Some of our systemics, though, we have noticed, especially for a foliar spray to an emergent plant, they will control the plant to the water line and then stop. They have trouble moving through that water line to the roots of the plants. That's not true of all systemic herbicides, but it is something to be aware of, so that if a landowner or stakeholder makes an application, that would be something to monitor later on. Did my control stop at the water line? Or for a submerged injection, did it stop a few feet down where the thermocline may exist in that pond?
And one thing that we haven't mentioned, but I've encountered a lot through the years, is be careful when you do an herbicide treatment, because if you've got plants in your pond you want to keep, you're likely to hurt them as well, depending on the herbicide you choose and the types of plants. So like oftentimes I have folks that have cypress trees and they're like, well, is this going to harm my cypress trees? Well, it could, it may, you just need to be cognizant of that fact ahead of time and choose the right herbicide and approach that doesn't translocate to the cypress trees. You're not doing a whole water application that the cypress trees are going to take up the herbicide as well. So, if you're trying to preserve some plants and trying to kill other plants, you need to take that into consideration as well, because you can certainly do harm as well to terrestrial plants. I mean, if you're spraying a foliar spray on a windy day, you may have herbicide drift. Your spray may not be staying where you're spraying it, may be blowing off to your garden or to your shoreline. So always keep that into account, and always read the label. The label is going to tell you all of this stuff. The label is the law, and you have to read it before you do really anything.
Yeah, and it's important too to read the sections on those labels that talk about restrictions on the use of that water after it's been treated. Something like diquat, you don't want to turn around and take that water and use it for irrigation. You're going to harm the plants. I think it's a 5-day hold that you have to hold that water before you can use it for irrigation. Some of them have livestock watering restrictions. You don't want your livestock drinking out of that pond for a day or 2 days or whatever the label recommendation is. So it's really important to look at those as well before you make an application, because you don't want to get halfway through it and realize, this is the only livestock pond I have. I have no other water source. What am I supposed to do now? So definitely know that on the front end before you make your application. Read that section and be aware of what you're going to need to do.
Yeah, some of the irrigation restrictions can go way out there. I know Florida owns 30 days, and I think I've seen them higher than that as well. I had a call yesterday from a guy that I think he had bladderwort and parrot's feather in his pond. He was going to apply, I think, endothol is what the original recommendation that he had received, which had, like I forget how many day animal use restriction, animal drinking restriction, and his dogs use the pond all the time. And I'm like, well, first of all, I wouldn't go with endothol to begin with. I'd go with diquat, and diquat should take care of both of those plants, and it only has a 1-day restriction. It's easy to keep your dog out of a pond for 1 day. It's pretty hard to keep a dog that likes to go outside out of a pond for 30 days. If you have special uses like livestock, like irrigation purposes, water intake for other purposes, human use, take that into consideration in your herbicide selection, because the herbicide could affect how you use that pond for the next certain period of time. So, Gray, we've been talking about chemical control of plants, but there are other options to landowners. Let's talk a little bit about some of the non-chemical approaches to controlling aquatic vegetation.
Yeah, so we have Our management strategies for aquatic plants fall in one of four categories: chemical, which we've discussed; biological control, which is where you use a living organism to control your pest; mechanical control, which is where you mechanically harm the plant. That would be like cutting or digging or harvesting. And then physical control, which is where you alter the environment around the plant so that it can't survive. And then when you start to mix and match control strategies from all those categories, we get into what we call integrated pest management. For most small pond landowners, biological control is going to be in the form of grass carp. And just like setting up to calculate an herbicide application, you need to know the size of your water body, the volume, the surface area. That's going to tell you how many carp to put in the water. I don't remember the current recommendation, but it's so many fish per acre at a certain size class of fish. The important thing to remember about carp is that they don't last forever. After 4 or 5 years, I think, Wes, you would know better than I, their feeding declines. And so you may see your problem plant come back after their feeding slows down. Once they reach max growth, they just don't eat as much. Mechanical control, that's where we're actually harming the plants. There are a few manufacturers out there that sell harvesting technology, and that can be in the form of a floating weed rake that will scoop up plants. It can be a cutter head that has a conveyor belt behind it that's actually actively cutting plants and then removing the dead biomass from the water body. Those are very slow, but they're very useful in situations where you don't want to use chemical, particularly areas with threatened and endangered species, or in some cases around drinking water intakes where there's not a good chemical solution. Harvesting technology really has a great fit there, but they are slow. You can treat hundreds to thousands of acres of water in a day with the appropriate boat or aerial technology. A harvester is going to give you a few acres a day, but they are very, very useful in the right situations. And then physical control, that's where we alter the water body so that a plant can't survive. That is where our dyes come in, where we apply dye to the water. Even though the dye is a chemical, it's not affecting the plants the way herbicides do. It's either absorbing sunlight or reflecting sunlight back into the atmosphere. And essentially, you're taking sunlight away from your plants, and they don't have what they need to produce the sugars they need for their basic metabolism, and they die from starvation, essentially. With dye technology, it's important to note that it really only works in deeper water. You need about 2 feet of treated water to reflect enough sunlight to inhibit plant growth. So if the plants have already topped out and they've made it to the upper layers of water, a dye application is not going to do you any good. And the dye only, the color may last in the water for months, but the reflective and absorptive properties only last for a month and a half to 2 months. So you have to periodically reapply that. And it's good to start that in the winter months before your plants start growing. That way the dye is already in the water. It's already inhibiting sunlight reaching those sediments where the plants are. And then keep reapplying that throughout the year. Dyes do not work on emergent plants or free-floating plants that have access to the atmosphere, typically just for algae control and submerged plant control. Another very common form of physical control that we see is drawdown. You're removing the water from the site. Aquatic plants need water. Without that, a lot of them will dry out and die. In some cases, they can survive drawdown. The roots will stay in the sediment. They can handle periods of drawdown and then come right back. So it goes back to the earlier point we made about knowing the plant that you're working with. In some cases, there's scientific literature out there that we already know that a drawdown is not going to work. Another important thing to note with drawdown, well, actually with any control technique, is that these plants, most of them can produce seeds that will be in your lake bed, in your sediments down there. If you take the water off the side and then you bring it back, the plant may survive as a seed and just come right back. Even though you've reduced the nuisance vegetative growth, you haven't taken care of the problem because there may be a seed bank down there that may come back. So knowing the plant, knowing the control strategy, and then being prepared for potential regrowth is something that needs to be considered for any control strategy somebody may select. But in particular, drawdown, that's one of the big ones. We'll draw a water body down, growth disappears, bring the water back, and then 2 years later, the plant returns. And the landowner says, what's going on? Drawdown was supposed to work. Well, there was a seed bank that came back.
Yeah, I know some some of these aquatic plant species, the seeds can persist in the soil for up to 1,000 years. So it's hard to fight that. Once you can kill them all back, there's always a source of weeds from the pond. The other thing was with another physical control that I recommend for really shallow ponds. Plants need light to grow. So plants can't grow if there's enough turbid or green water above them that the sunlight doesn't penetrate to the soil underneath. So if you have a real shallow pond, it's going to grow plants because the sunlight penetrates down to the soil and plants can germinate and grow. So pond deepening is another one that's used a lot for these shallow ponds, where you deepen the shorelines to at least 3 foot deep. And you don't want to have a 90-degree drop off. You want to have a nice gradual slope that's safe and won't cause erosion. But once your pond usually gets down to about 3 foot deep, if it's remotely fertile, which in Mississippi most of them are, it's usually green enough that not enough light penetrates down to the bottom and it shades out the plants. And then you mentioned the grass carp. Yeah, grass carp, they're kind of an all or none control. I like to use them for preventative measures. So when you stock a pond that has no weeds, you can put out in a small pond, maybe 5 per acre, and a really big pond, maybe 3 per acre, because a lot of the pond is open water. And that will prevent weeds from becoming established. But when you actually have an established weed problem, it depends on the species, first of all, whether or not grass carp want to eat it. I mean, they're not going to control rigid, woody plants. They like to have those little succulent, submerged plants, things that are like lettuce to them. If it's really abundant, say you've got a pond that's chock full of southern Naiad, you may need 20, 25 grass carp per acre to get that under control. If you put out too few, they don't keep up with the growth. And if you put out too many, they eliminate it all. And then you got a pond full of big grass carp. So, grass carp are tricky as a control method. They're much better, I think, as a preventative method. And you're right, they eat 100% of their body weight per year at first, and then that slows down. If you feed your fish, they really love pelletized feed. They've ate it at the hatchery, and they're going to eat it in your pond, and they'll switch to that. So grass carp are tricky. They're one tool in the toolbox, but they're not a solves all for aquatic weed problems for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. When I recommend grass carp, it's almost always as part of an integrated strategy for plant control rather than a standalone control method.
Me too. It's usually treat it, knock it back, let the grass carp finish it off, and keep it gone.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at wes, that's W-E-S, .neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's M-S-S-T-A-T-E, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show.
Well, Gray, I think we spent a lot of time talking about killing plants. I want to talk a little bit about establishing good plants. Not a whole lot of time because, we can't really get into species and stuff without images that people can see. But really, when you choose a plant for a pond, you want to choose something that is beneficial to the pond. It's native, very important. Don't introduce anything non-native, but also that is either relatively non-invasive or can be controlled. Now, every plant has the potential to expand and take over, and all plants probably will require some level of control, but there are a few things that people can do to try to minimize that. And one is picking the right species, right?
Yeah, picking the right species that will help you reach your management goals for your pond, not just for controlling species, but to have the water resource you want, and then planting them in such a way that they inhibit the growth or the invasion potential of non-native species or some of these nuisance species. Just as species ID is important for controlling plants, it's also important for establishing a beneficial community, plant community in your pond or around the margins of your ponds. All of these species, they don't all grow exactly the same way, and understanding how they grow will help you with the selection that you need to get the most bang for your buck when it comes to making that pond be the resource you want it to be.
and some of the things you can do to try to minimize growth. Some species are more shoreline species. I love pickerel weed. Pickerel weed's a beautiful plant. It doesn't spread very fast. It only grows in very shallow water. It'll really add to the aesthetics of the pond. But you may want something for your fish populations, like a pondweed, like potamogeton. And with potamogeton, that can take over a pond if the pond is shallow. So if you want to try to do something like potamogeton, then consider planting it on just shallow humps that are surrounded by deep water, putting it in pots. You can get a big cement pot and put it out there with soil in it and plant the plant, and then control it whenever it spreads outside the pot. A stand of potamogeton growing out of a large pot is going to create a nice bit of habitat. It's going to spread out from that pot. But if you find it growing elsewhere, you may want to control it with herbicides. Now, if you stocked grass carp, you're going to have a real hard time establishing it. I know a lot of our state agency folks have been trying to reestablish aquatic vegetation in a number of reservoirs, but the reservoirs have a lot of species in them, not just fish, but, things like nutria, muskrats that eat aquatic vegetation.
I've run into so many herbicide trials that we've had to run twice because turtles got into the site and defoliated it. So we were not able to determine the true effects of some of the chemicals we wanted to test. So there's a lot of wildlife out there, like you said, that is more than willing to eat your plants when you go to put them in a pond.
I think the take-home message from the podcast really is that not all plants are bad, but when they become a problem, you can control them. So, we talked a little bit about establishing these beneficial plants, but really what I want to finish up with is where landowners can go to get assistance. We talked about the cooperative extension service that's available in most states. Obviously they're there to help you. They're a source of unbiased information. Your state fisheries management agency, your natural resources conservation service, these are all good places to contact for aquatic plant advice, whether you're introducing, controlling, or otherwise working with the plants in your pond. You can always check those out. But I wanted to end with a plug for a new resource that you and I have been working on that's coming out very soon. We've been working on a series of aquatic plant management fact sheets that are going to be published in a book. The book's going to be called Southeastern Aquatic Plants Identification, Control, and Establishment. We're going to have a website that's associated with it and print-on-demand fact sheets. So hopefully we're going to make a lot of this information we've talked about today much more available to people and available at your fingertips. We're going to have a new website on Mississippi State's Extension website called Waterways. Check it out. Use it to help identify plants and then see their management benefit, see their control methods, the latest and greatest ways to use herbicides and other techniques to control them. There's a lot of opportunities, to address plant issues from this new resource that we're working on. So I'm excited to see that come out. Hopefully the hard copy of that will be printed here in the next couple of months.
And it's going to be on a water-resistant paper, so it can also be used as a field guide if our resource managers want to take it to the field with them. It's not one that has to be left indoors. So we've really tried to make this as robust as we can.
Well, Gray, is there anything else we want to talk about before we wrap this up? Any take-home points you want to leave with the audience?
Monitor. Go out there and know what's in your water resource, know everything you can about it, and that's part of the key to keeping it the resource you want it to be.
Yeah, and keep in mind, when you do select your aquatic herbicide treatment plan and you apply it, one dose often is inefficient. One dose is not enough. You need to reapply. Multiple applications are often necessary. So Gray's mentioned in the monitoring, you need to pay attention when you see those weeds pop up, hit them again. Sometimes they store that energy in the root systems and can come back. And the only way to control them, I'm thinking of stuff like, some of the really nasty stuff that's got really big tubers. They can store energy for a long time, and you need to hit them over and over again to deplete that energy before you get a complete kill.
Yeah, and that's true for any management technique, not just herbicide as well. Any plant that stores a lot of energy is going to have a high potential for regrowth after that. And so repeated measures of control are often going to be needed.
Well, Gray, thank you so much for coming on today. I enjoyed talking with you. I think we imparted a lot of very important information. And if folks will look up that Waterweeds website when it's available. It's still under construction right now, but it is available. And if you want to request a copy of the Southeastern Aquatic Plants book that's going to be coming out in a little while, you can contact me. Go to my Facebook page, and you can write me there and give me your name and address, and we potentially can get that out to you as soon as it's available. But Gray, again, thank you so much for coming on today. Hopefully folks have learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, and everyone, thanks for joining Fish University. I hope to see you here next month.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.